Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Orange Nerd Show. On this show, we talk about everything except the parks. So in this video, we're going to talk about a host of things, including our modern references kind of ruining or dating Disney animated films. We're going to talk about Bob Iger versus Bob Eisner. There's just a ton of stuff we're going to discuss. I brought my good friend and the host of Freshly Squeezed, VashSky. Vash, welcome back, buddy.
It is great to be back. I think this is some pretty good discussion here. I think you have a nice range of topics. I am very excited to get into it.
Perfect. Well, you know what? Let's dive right in. So Disney animated films.
Yeah.
Disney animated films. And I'll give you my opinion on this. I want to hear from you first, though. Mm-hmm. Over the years, and it's not, to be fair, it's not just under the recent Bob Iger era. It started really with kind of like Michael Eisner, even long time ago, of this trend of adding a lot of modern references, modern subject material into these Disney animated films. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel it dates the films? Do you feel it goes against what Walt wanted with these films? What are your feelings on that not new trend, but this kind of modern trend?
Well, I think a lot of it is what kind of story you're telling. I think modern references work better in some places than others. If you have an extremely modern reference like hashtags or something like that in a film like Tangled, well, that's going to come off very differently than a film like Wreck-It Ralph, for example. So I think it is very much contextual and circumstantial. But generally speaking, not a fan. It's just, it does date them. And it does maybe encapsulate a time and a place and a thought process that is a little bit too much. Obviously, art is a reflection of the times that it is constructed in. That is fundamentally what art is. And how much you reflect the times that you're making that in is determinative of a lot of things. But in the context of kind of the Disney canon of the Disney films, the great animated films, I think it's a miss.
Fantastic points there. And I think the best example of that stark difference of doing it wrong and doing it correctly would be Oliver Company versus The Little Mermaid. In Oliver Company, they go all in. All chips are in with the 80s. The music, the clothing styles, everything about Oliver and Company screams the 1980s. When you watch that movie, it's a very dated film. It looks like, that Beverly Hills Cop kind of era, right?
Right.
It's very in your face. Whereas you watch a movie like Little Mermaid, which again was from the 80s. It was 1989. And there's subtle references to the 80s. I mean, I know that Ariel's wedding dress was inspired by Princess Diana's wedding dress. Her big bangs that were kind of blown out, right? Very 80s, but the references are subtle. And they're not in your face. And if you look at both of those films, which film is still relevant today and which film isn't? Well, Little Mermaid is still relevant. The movie that kind of went all out with those very dated references kind of been tossed into the dustbin of history, so to speak. Not many people talk about Oliver and Company anymore. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think it dates these films. I think one of the big reasons why Walt Disney wanted to do like these old fairy tales, like a Snow White and a Cinderella and a Sleeping Beauty, is that he understood that the timelessness of these stories, and that if he could create movies based on these timeless stories, his movies would in essence be timeless going forward. And I think somewhere along the line, Disney sort of lost that,
Yeah, and I think some of it's just derived by just good business. Look, back in the day, Walt and films going into post-Walt, even in the Eisner era, they would be re-released every 7 years or whatever. And obviously, they didn't start with that practice. It was kind of one of necessity, but it became really important. Okay, well, if we're going to have a film, it's got to be timeless. It has to be kind of a classic that can play in any era, in any time period. I mean, to your point, if you take Oliver and Company, I think it's very much of the time period it was created. But if you take Little Mermaid, for example, and you play that anywhere, the animation style is a little, it's a little,
older.
Yeah, it's older, vintage, right? It's of the era. But I think you could play that and still get a lot of that audience reaction the same way that it occurred back in the 1980s, because it is such a timeless classic in that way. And when you talk about, hey, we're going to restore these films for DVD, Blu-ray, 4K releases and stuff like that, and we're going to take the animation and restore that and put it out there, hey, they still sell. It still sells. It still plays. And kids growing up now who maybe don't have the wider context of the animation styles and how they've changed, they can see Little Mermaid and be completely enamored and immersed into it. Whereas Oliver and Company, I don't think plays that same way. Now, a lot of that is, to our discussion here, the modern references that kind of date that film. And it's like, look, when you're talking about vinyl records and tapes and stuff like that, I mean, kids gonna look at you and go, "What the heck are they talking about here?"
Right.
Whereas Little Mermaid, it doesn't rely on those things as story points, plot points, or even the butt of jokes and so forth. And so it plays a lot better and is a lot more timeless in that regard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And two recent films that Walt Disney Animation Studios has done, which I liked these two movies, for the record, but there were elements in these two movies that I feel like they really, kind of almost sabotaged the film's timelessness going forward, and that was Moana and Raya the Last Dragon. And Moana, and Disney Animation does this a lot, which I love. What they'll do is they'll research the area, the culture, the people, the music, the art of a certain area. So for Moana, the artists would really research, Polynesia, right? And get into that and try to be as accurate as possible. And I respect that. And I love that. That's fantastic. And they make this gorgeous movie deeply rooted in Polynesian culture. And then somewhere down the line, they decide, hey, it's a great idea to throw in a Twitter joke. And I'm like, this is the worst of this is the worst ideas, because look, I know as a theme park community, we wouldn't put up with this. Like if Jack Sparrow had a dialogue in the Pirates of the Caribbean where he was giving Twitter references or holding a cell phone, the fan community would be a total outrage. You're breaking that story, that time period, right?
Well, yes, absolutely. But to your point, even when it was maybe thematically appropriate, like with Spider-Man recently, that Spider-Man show, you hear him. Oh yeah, hashtag me. Make sure you get a selfie with me. Oh, roller coaster. That got a lot of pushback, even though it was a period correct. And it's just it's that level of, hey, I want to be immersed. I want to be transported. And when you reference something, you're now breaking my immersion.
Exactly.
You're now, pulling the real world into it, and it's distracting. And it is, instead of bringing me more enjoyment, you're actually sucking enjoyment out of it.
Exactly. Perfectly said. Exactly. And that's what they do. They're taking, they have spent all this time and effort and energy into creating this, incredibly accurate world representative of that culture, and then they throw in these jokes, which in all fairness might be the executives telling them to do that. I don't know, but then it just sucks you out. It's like, I don't know if you saw Raya the Last Dragon, which was actually a good movie. I actually really enjoyed it. It was heavily inspired by Vietnamese culture. My girlfriend's Vietnamese, so it hit really close to home for me. And the movie, the world building and the Vietnamese kind of references and the way they played on the culture was gorgeous. But then they would throw in this stuff. Like there's a whole scene with the dragon, not to spoil it or anything, but I mean, this wasn't really a major part, but the dragon's in this village, like talking about charging things to her credit card and stuff like that. I'm like, why have that scene? You built this fantastic world, you know, which is like, you know, it's obviously not of our world. It's not the modern world. Why would you suck us out of that beautiful world that you built that's deeply inspired by Vietnamese culture and suck us out with the dragon making jokes about charging stuff for her credit card? It's pointless. And what does that do? It takes away from the movie, in my opinion.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up, because now I'm thinking, like, you know, people are going to say, well, what about the genie? The genie was somebody who would reference, you know, make modern references all day long kind of thing. Right. And, you know, couldn't you make the argument that, well, okay, well, you talk about this, but everybody loved the genie. And that's what made that movie great. And I will agree. But sometimes it really is about execution. And when it's not executed properly, or if it's inconsistent with the larger world and the larger story playing out, like you say, Raya of the Last Dragon, it looks like they went through a lot of research to accurately recreate the world that they were attempting to present. Obviously with certain embellishments, but you get my point. Very immersive. Right. I don't think Aladdin was done to that great extent, first off. And I think so contextually that's a little bit different. But I think, you know, Robin Williams, being such the great performer that he was, could pull it off successfully and not necessarily bring you out of it and get you to fully understand the wider context of that character. So much of it is, with anything else, execution. And didn't look like it materialized in the same way that it did for Aladdin. You know, right, the Last Dragon.
Yeah, and with Aladdin, like if it was up to me, I wouldn't have had a lot of those modern references in Aladdin. But I will say this: as much as I didn't like the modern references, you know, the Arsenio Hall and all that stuff, right? Yep. As much as I didn't like that, my brain can kind of justify it, and maybe this is just me, but like I can kind of justify it in the sense that this is a genie who has probably seen thousands of years in the future and thousands of years in the past. He's been dealing with people and wishes and granting wishes, you know, for eons and eons, where it's not completely unrealistic to believe that he's been in 1993 before or 2035 or whatever, because being a genie, you think that you would be, you know, you would transcend that time. So a cosmic being. So I kind of forgive it a little bit with that compared to like a film like Moana, where there's no explanation for her to know about Twitter or tweeting, you know? So yeah, I mean, but you know, like I said, it's not just the Iger era. Hercules was another movie in the Michael Eisner era that was heavily bombarded with modern references, with like, you know, the Air Hercules shoes or the Air Herc shoes, right? The sandals. That was a big thing. So it's been going on for a while, you know, but I'm not a fan of it. I'm really not.
No. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I know this is kind of a faux pas to bring up his name. I get it, but you know, it's history, guys. We got to talk about it at least a little bit. I think Lasseter was a guy that really pushed back against a lot of that stuff. And he kind of understood, like, you know, we're talking about classic, you know, kind of the Disney canon, Disney classics. We want these films to be as relevant today as they are, you know, 10, 20, 30 years from now. So don't date your pictures in that way. Don't, you know, kind of, should I say, just, you know, don't age them out prematurely by having these references in there. Right. You know, hold back a little bit on those things. And again, when you have new talent come in, old talent make their way out, that culture is affected. The cultural norms are affected, and what the culture that you're creating in that creative environment, what they prioritize is also affected. And sometimes that emphasis on no references is just not seen as strongly as maybe previous previous cultures or regimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, like Walt Disney wasn't completely against modern references, but he never really did them in his animated films. Like the feature films kind of stayed away from that, where like he would use, like I saw shorts of the Walt Disney era, like shorts and cartoons that would utilize Mickey and Goofy and stuff in modern settings. And that's fine. If Disney wants to go that route with, their Mickey Mouse shorts or the short films they do with Pixar and things like that, by all means, utilize the modern stuff in those mediums. But I just feel with the Disney animated films, it's the storybook studio. It's the timeless studio where you want to have these films, play just as well to audiences in 30 years as they do today. Yeah. And they've lost that in a lot of ways. And again, to be fair, it's not just Iger. It also was Eisner. Eisner was just as guilty. There's a lot of films in the Eisner era that really played to this, unfortunately.
There are, and it's just, some of it is, like the changes that were going through animation at the time. Jeffrey Katzenberg being on the in versus him being on the out, and the animators who maybe have pushed back against him when it came to modern references. Maybe that changed when he made his unceremonious exit at that time. And, it just, you have different directors, you just had different mindsets going into some of these films, which are pervasive in how that is constructed. But it's interesting because, we look back at the Walt Disney era of films, and, the modern references weren't maybe as strong as they are now, and I will agree. But it's interesting, the creatives, especially when Walt was not as, when he turned his attention towards the parks and maybe wasn't as attentive when it came to changes that were going on in the studio. One of those big things that in the way that animators before kind of imbued their films with maybe modern references or subtexts was through animation itself. If you look at like a film like 101 Dalmatians, the artistry is much different than any film before or after, really.
Sure.
And the Xerox process and so forth, I mean, that was a very modern film for that time. If you look at the artistic styles and everything, I mean, really, really examine that. And that was, I would say, as modern as it gets. And, Walt he didn't like it. He did not like the Xerox process. I don't think he appreciated that animation. But it was such a radical departure. And some of that was just, hey, look, they went very traditional with Sleeping Beauty. And they just wore themselves out completely on it. I mean, it's these big 70 millimeter prints that they would have to do, and it was just painstaking. The animation, the very tedious animation style that they went with that movie, and they wanted a big change, and that's what came out of it was 101 Dalmatians, and it was just very different. It was extremely different for the time, and that's how they went modern in that day, was through animation itself, and it's very different than doing it via hashtags or tweets and so forth. And I think I would like Disney to be a little bit more cognizant of that going forward with their films. That's just me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think each studio needs to have its own identity. Like I'm more okay with Pixar going the more modern route. I think that the reason why you have multiple studios under one umbrella is so you can do that, so you can have different approaches to the same thing. Like, I don't want Pixar to be telling us, doing like fairy tales and musicals. I want them to be Pixar, and I want Disney animated films to be Disney. And it's okay to separate the two. I want to see Disney animated films be the storybook studio that are more, that, they do the more timeless material, the fairy tales, the more not dated, and Pixar, they can do a modern story like Soul, which is fantastic because they're a different studio. And you know what? They should be able to do an experiment with different things. You want to have the differences between those two, because otherwise there's no point in having two different studios if they're going to, release the same material, So I think that there's definitely a different, a different approach for each studio. Disney Animation though should be that storybook studio, and God bless Howard Ashman, because that man, I mean, if anyone understood the Disney animated film, it was Howard Ashman. I mean, that guy, and that's why we had the movies we did with Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, a lot, and that it's Howard Ashman. He got it. He modernized them in the right way, though. Like, Beauty and the Beast was a modern take, really, on the old Disney Walt era musicals, but it was done in a modern way that wasn't like, I'm going to have a rap segment because it's the 90s. It was modern in a sense where it was like the next evolutionary step, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, 100%. 100%. He just understood what the audience, I think, was looking for and what they maybe expected, but do it in a way that is modern, that does evoke emotion that people, because, before Little Mermaid, Don Hahn talks about it. I was just like, dude, nobody, no teenager, no huge demographics of the movies that we were trying to appeal to, they wouldn't be caught dead in a Disney film for so long. And Little Mermaid really changed that in profound and substantial ways. And like you said, Howard Ashman, his influence cannot be understated in that regard.
Yeah. Absolutely. So while we're on the subject of the Renaissance era and everything,
Sure.
We're going to pivot to the next topic, which is, and this is going to be a good one, I think. This is Bob Iger, the Bob Iger era versus the Michael Eisner era. The differences, the good, the bad, the ugly. There's a lot to chew on in terms of this topic.
Good Lord.
Good Lord. There is a lot to go on here.
Yeah.
Let's start with the movies. Since we're kind of already talking about the movies, the Bob Iger era versus the Eisner era. What are your overall thoughts on the animated movies from both of these eras? Good, bad, indifferent?
Well, that's interesting. Okay, so when Eisner came in, it was interesting because I don't think he had the same appreciation for animation that maybe Iger did. When Eisner came in, it was just like, hey, look, we have to make Disney successful in any way we can. Do we necessarily do it through animation? And Roy pushed back. Roy was like, hey, look, this is the heartblood of the company. Anything we produce here will become substantial products in merchandising, licensing, in the parks. It imbues creativity throughout the entire company. You get rid of animation, it's the lifeblood of what Disney is. You can't do that. And I think when they started to release the films on video, I think Eisner had a newfound appreciation for what animation could become and for what it was. And so he selected Jeffrey Katzenberg to lead that process off. And, Jeffrey was like, he was not an animation guy at the time. But I think he understood what the audience wanted from Disney, from animated films, and had a really good instincts in how the audience thought of these films. And how they associated themselves with these films and really understood what they wanted from them. So when it comes to the differences between the Eisner era and the Iger era, I think a lot of it has to do with Jeffrey Katzenberg, and like we've already stated before, Howard Ashman. When Howard Ashman came in, the whole game changed.
Yeah.
They started to be more musical focused, but in the best way possible, that just, you remember some of those great scores, those great lines and so forth. And that's probably one of the more profound changes, or one of the most profound differences between that era and maybe the Iger era. Much more musical driven, very technology driven. This is quite interesting, though. What is your take between the two, in your estimation?
If you were to ask me which era of animation do I prefer, I think because I am more traditional when it comes to Disney animated films. I really am, and I think I would definitely prefer the Eisner era. I mean, even just those Renaissance films. If you take Mermaid, Beauty, Aladdin, Lion King, those films alone, I think, kind of put Eisner era over the top. They were just so good. Not to say the Iger era didn't have its gems. I this might be unpopular and unpopular opinion, but I actually really enjoyed Frozen. I did. It kind of reminded me, in a lot of ways of that Eisner era, that Renaissance era. The music, the sweeping musical sequences. It was very much of that era. But for the most part, I think that Eisner's era of animation was much more rooted in traditional Disney animation, and their storytelling. Yeah, there were misses along the way, especially towards the end with Home on the Range. And,
the post Renaissance era for sure.
Yeah, and Chicken Little and stuff. But I think for the most part, even if you take the films that didn't do so well, like Atlantis, they were still very much in that same vein of the classic animated movie. I loved things like Tarzan. I would have to give, with animated films, I'd have to give the win to the Eisner era. In my opinion,
I think so, and a lot of it too is like, a lot of these guys were, who undertook a lot of these films were Cal Arts guys. That there is kind of a connection between the people of the Renaissance era and of the Walt Disney era, because a lot of those guys trained a lot of them through the Cal Arts program for animation. And so with that connection and everything, with Howard Ashman, with Don Hahn, with Jeffrey Katzenberg, it's just that lightning in a bottle, of just amazing talent and guys that were hungry to prove that they could do what so many of them doubted. Ron Miller just didn't have a clue what to do with these guys. This is just this wellspring of talent, and they lost them along the way. Tim Burton was in there, Lasseter was in there. Guys that they just didn't know what to do with, really. They integrated them back in Disney fold in other ways, but man, it's just that talent, that richness, that they kicked them out of the animation building, the Burbank building, and into Glendale, and they kind of had this camaraderie when that happened and stuff like that. It was really make or break. That whole thing, God, you just can't get over that. Now the Iger era, which we can kind of get into the Iger and the Eisners. Eisner was, he had his falling out with Pixar, right? Pixar thought they were maybe better or more highly valued than maybe Eisner thought they were. Right. And kind of burned that bridge a little bit.
Yeah.
Ironically, he was selected for his relationships, and now at the end, he's burning them, right? Which was unfortunate. But Iger understood. I think Iger was like, "Hey, look, we have not been relevant in a lot of our creative avenues for a while. There's untapped potential here, but we just do not have the creatives that we need to really turn this machine on." And we've got the Pixar guys there who we know are extremely talented, extremely creative, who are gung-ho. We're going to have to integrate them into the company. And we're going to have to fuse, their creativity will provide the fuel for this company going forward. And so I think Iger understood the value of Pixar. And that was a thing, maybe that was, better than his predecessor at that time, was he understood the value of these creators, understood the value of what Pixar brought to the table, and went out and purchased them, integrated a lot of their creators into other parts of the company. And there would be no Iger animation era that we're speaking about if he hadn't done that. So in that way, I give him credit.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Bob Iger was a visionary in every sense of the word. And he definitely had the insight to know And this is what Iger had definitely over Michael Eisner, is that Iger understood, I need to buy the cow, not the carton of milk.
Yeah.
I want to buy the cow so I can have milk forever. Where Michael Eisner was more like, well, I'll just buy the milk as we go. Like, for example, Michael Eisner, he bought Nickelodeon Doug. Doug was a hot property back in the day. So what's Michael Eisner going to do? I'll just buy the character. Cool, we're done. Where like, okay, that's great, but like, okay, what happens when the character's not popular anymore? Where exactly. Bob Iger was like, no, you don't buy the character, you buy the whole studio, because it's the studio, the people in that building that are making these great franchises. So if you buy the studio, they can turn out great franchises for you to the end of time, as opposed to just buying one individual property that's hot right now. So Iger was definitely more forward thinking, I think in terms of that. He made the right move buying Pixar. And I think it paid off in spades. And he's done it over and over again with like Marvel and Star Wars, and it goes on.
We'll definitely get into for sure. Speaking of that, look, Eisner tried buying the cow. Like in terms of Jim Henson, for example, right? And he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna get in bed with Jim Henson. We're gonna have this amazing collaboration. We're gonna get the Muppets. It's gonna be great." What he should have probably done was bought, Jim Henson's studio and all of those great puppeteers and so forth, which I don't believe that happened. And because of that, when Jim Henson, the man, died, that was a big hit, in terms of that vision, in terms of that goal. And so, I think Michael Eisner, some of what he did was very short term, and he didn't think about the long term implications of a lot of the stuff that was going on. Whereas Iger was extremely calculated in everything that he did.
Yeah, no, 100%. Absolutely. Yeah. That's definitely the case here. Bob Iger is a long-term guy. He is a long-term guy.
Oh, yeah.
And I know we don't usually talk about the parks when it comes to Orange Nerd, but I want to kind of dive into it a little bit because it's almost impossible to separate these two men without talking about the parks even at least a little bit. Mm-hmm. With Iger versus Eisner, what are your thoughts on the theme parks and their approaches for that? I mean, that's a loaded thing.
I was just gonna say this, okay? That if you want a perfect representation, if you want a perfect encapsulation of what it was like, of the the kind of different styles of management, the kind of prioritization of different things, or if you just wanted a reflection of what the larger implications were for the entire company under the various stages of the Eisner era and the Iger era, you can look no better than Disneyland Resort. Disneyland Resort covers it all when you really think about it. Because as soon as Eisner gets in there, he's gun-ho. He's like, I'm going to relaunch this thing. I'm going to build this thing, man. I'm going to do stuff I'm going to make it relevant again. What do you get? You get Captain EO, you get Star Tours, you get Splash Mountain, you get the Videopolis. You get just a drive that's just kind of like, I'm going to get this right here. And it really apexes with probably Indiana Jones Adventure.
Yeah.
And then right after that, exactly, right? Eisner kind of loses his way. And honestly, it's not really his fault. A lot of that I think was Frank Wells, to be fair, too. I would say 3 to 4, really 4 big incidents happen at the same time, right? And they all happen within 6 months of each other, just to understand, guys. Okay. Disneyland Paris falls completely short, right? Just this big old multi-billion-dollar exercise. And it just flops. It's just no better way to characterize it. It flops. And one of the last things Frank Wells did was handle that whole thing, really get that from being so red to being black, and working it out with the bankers and investors and so forth to really kind of get that and manage it under control. But it really was a drag on the company. And Disney themselves, and Eisner especially, lost a lot of enthusiasm and got a little gun shy when it came to a lot of the investments that were going on in the parks at that time. So that's one. That's just one. Frank Wells dies. And it sets off a tragic wave of events. I mean, if you want to talk about yin and yang, It really is Eisner and Frank Wells. When he passed away, it's just, Tony Baxter talks about it. Tony Baxter and Bruce Gordon. When it came to Splash Mountain, it was like really expensive, this really big investment. It's going to cost a lot of money. And Eisner, even though Brett Eisner, there was that famous story where it's like, oh, we got to build this, we got to do this. It's like, okay. But he looks at that price tag and it's like, man, I don't know if we can do that. You boys, you meet with Frank Wells. Well, let's get this figured out. And Tony Baxter and Bruce Gordon, they pitch him all this kind of stuff. And it's just this great, magnificent piece of Imagineering, storytelling, and all that. And Frank Wells is like, man, that's really cool. And he just looks at that price tag, and Tony Baxter and Bruce Gordon, they're just kind of deflated because he's just looking at it, going, it's just too much, it's just too expensive, guys. And they're kind of crestfallen about it. And Frank Wells comes back and says, well, we can't not do it. We got to figure this out. And that's Frank Wells. And Frank Wells was like, okay, look, if I come back with this budget, that the way it is, I'm going to get killed. So listen, do we need this? Can we do this? Can we do that? And shaved like $10 million off the budget. Not a whole lot, but just enough to get it going. It was like, okay, I can take this to him and we can get this done. And that's Frank Wells. That he just had that vision, that insight, like, hey, we got to do this project. We cannot. And when he died, it was profound. It was bad. It was really bad. And when and then the next shoe to drop is Jeffrey Katzenberg walking out the door. Right. And that has a huge effect on animation and that path going forward. Howard Ashman as well. You could probably file that in there. Animation was completely affected. And then the last thing, quadruple bypass surgery for Michael Eisner. 6 months, all this stuff happens. And it just has a reverberating effect throughout the entire company. I mean, it really, really does. Yeah. And we see that. That's why the change in philosophy when it comes to Disney Resort is so profound so fast. In 1995, we have Indiana Jones. It's like this big, all amazing thing. It's like, oh my God, this is incredible. 3 years later, 1998, Tomorrowland.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And it's just like, day. It's night and day, right? There's some quality there, but for the most part, And going through this, by the way, as a kid, right, it was very interesting. And then 3 years after that, 2001 DCA.
Right.
Right. And it's just like, whoa. That experience in France really did affect you guys, didn't it? And yeah, it did. Right. And then going through this Disneyland resort kind of lesson here, what do we get? We get a lot of Pixar integration. That kind of merger starts, begins. And you see that with Disney California Adventure and a lot of its rides it gets. A lot of it's Pixar-based. Some things in Disneyland are Pixar-based. And when Iger takes the reins and is in full charge, you could see them coming out of it with the 50th anniversary. Iger's introduced. And when he gets in, it's like, hey, we have to fix what happened in 2001 with the opening of Disney California Adventure. And Iger, when presented many options about what to do, I mean, there were concepts, guys, about Disney California Adventure. Maybe you make it free and don't actually charge for it. It was that kind of, or maybe you make it as one big park. Instead of going into two parks, you splice it together into one big mega park with Disneyland and California Adventure combined. But the last option is, well, okay, we invest into it heavily, like $1 billion+ and make it into the Disney park that it's supposed to be. And to Iger's credit, he knew that option 3 was the right one. He knew it was the right way to go.
It was the right call. And this is going to sound very, very cynical, but I think that it's definitely the reality. I mean, there's a reason why I think that they opted for the 2 park resort as opposed to the one big ginormous Disneyland park And look, I technically it wouldn't really matter either way if it's the same rides and stuff. It's technically on paper the same equation, but financially though it is different, because when you have two parks, psychologically that hits people differently than one big park. So if you were just have one mega Disneyland, people still see it, no matter if it could be 1,000 acres, it doesn't matter. People still see that as one park. Oh, we can do that in a day. It's one park. Once you take it and make two parks, the psychology changes.
Yeah.
It's no longer, I can do that in one day. Well, no, there's two parks here. DCA could have been 3 acres. It doesn't matter. It's two parks. People think like, oh, I can't do that in a day, you know? And so what happens when you can't do a park in a day? Well, you got to start looking for hotels, because you need to start staying another day or two, because you got to do everything at the resort, you know? And so I think that it was a smart move to make sure that DCA was a separate ticketed thing, because it pushes more hotel stays. Because psychologically people want to finish everything, and they feel like if you have two parks, you just can't do it in one day, whether that's the case or not. It doesn't even have to be even reality. Psychologically, though, the assumption is 2 parks, can't do it, got to get a hotel.
Right. And, you know, it's quite funny. There have been, if you want to see how this plays out, guys, there's a park in, I think it was like in Ohio. It was like a Six Flags park adjacent to a SeaWorld park. And Six Flags buys the next door SeaWorld park to make a huge mega resort. It completely flops. It's no longer around.
Wow.
You know, you can, it's a different value statement, right? And it takes vision to do those things. But what Iger did was the bigger risk, for sure.
Oh yeah.
Because you're investing quite a heavy amount of money, and this was right around the time the stock market was going to crash in 2008. And it was like, man, are they going to stick to their guns? Are they going to do this?
They did.
And they did, you know, and I think, you know, using this Disneyland Resort kind of time stream, this reflection of what was going on in the company, I think you could see that Iger was committed to quality. He was committed to the Disney brand. He was committed to the guest experience and what guests associate with DCA and what they could associate with DCA. And man, he made the right call. I will give him this. That was one of the best decisions he ever made. And he used that as a template going forward to undo a lot of the stuff that maybe Eisner, he bit off a lot more than he can chew. I mean, Eisner, when it came to the parks and resorts, you know, it was quantity over quality a lot of times.
Right. Exactly.
And you know, we were talking about the short term versus long term kind of thing. It's like, in the short term, this is going to be great.
Yeah.
You know, but it's like, you know, it's like, man, we have 4 parks now in Walt Disney World, and, you know, 2 of them don't feel complete. You have Disneyland Paris over here, and it's like, well, we have contracts where we have to add in another park over there, or else we lose the land, and some crazy negotiation there. We have Hong Kong, you know, and it's really Iger's like, okay, you know, he made a lot of these calls. I have to make them work.
Right.
And that's kind of the way he kind of thought about it. We only got 1 new park under the Iger era, which was Shanghai. And that was, you know, that was a very calculated move to do that. When it came to the other parks, it was like, no, we're going to make them work. We're going to imbue the quality that is befitting of the Disney company, the Disney brand. And we're just going to make a lot of the things that Eisner got us into work on all cylinders like it never had before, because there's so much potential in what he did.
Right.
And so, you know, you look at ESPN, you look at a lot of the ways like he diversified the brand, how he expanded resorts and stuff like that. And it was just taking that, and it was just putting the it that it needed to really burn sound. And that's how you go from, you know, when Eisner walks in, it's like, I think $2 a share. When he leaves, it's about $70 a share. And when Iger leaves, it's like $150+ a share.
Unbelievable.
The way that happens is, you know, yeah, it's it's calculated measures. It's these things that you do to make these things work, not so much quantity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that at least for Disneyland Resort, I think that the Iger era was better for Disneyland Resort. I think that polishing, fleshing out DCA was something that we had to do. It was so important to do that for DCA, and Bob Iger got it done. Is it perfect? No, but no park is perfect. Even Disneyland, the king of all theme parks, isn't perfect. Tomorrowland's a mess, right? So every park is going to have its problems, but DCA is a much better park today than it was before. Definitely. And Eisner was really, really good for Walt Disney World in the sense that he really fleshed out that resort into like a multi-day thing. I mean, geez, he walked in, it was like, I think the only parks there at the time were the Magic Kingdom and Epcot, right? Yep. And then he added Disney MGM Studios, which is now Hollywood Studios. He added Animal Kingdom. He really fleshed that out with a lot of the shopping districts and hotels, and he did a lot of great stuff for Florida.
But he did a lot of great stuff for Disneyland Resort too. I mean, look, the Bass Brothers came to him. Yeah, Indiana Jones. But even more than that, the Bass Brothers came in and said, "Hey, look, you got to make Walt Disney World work, right? Like, Epcot doesn't work the way it's supposed to. We have to improve the state of things here. That's really where the cash cow is." And so he did infuse, like, hey, we're gonna build out resorts. We're gonna position them next to Epcot to really fulfill the Epcot park and make that work and stuff like that, and just kind of build that resort out and make it a multi-day vacation destination. But for Disneyland, there were some good things that the Eisner era did do. Hey, he got Anaheim to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into creating the resort district for Disneyland, and that has still proven to be one of the best things about the Disneyland Resort.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great point, Vash, because I mean, I'm old enough. I'm sure you're old enough where we remember what that area looked like prior to DCA, because it was not. The surrounding area right now is beautiful. The Anaheim area around Disneyland looks great. It didn't always look that good. It was pretty seedy back in the day.
It was, and it give Eisner credit. Now, some of the things that they did to do that was, maybe a little shady in some respects. The Long Beach Anaheim negotiation type thing, pitting cities against each other. That's a whole other story, though. But it's profound, the changes that were made to the Anaheim Resort District under the Eisner era to pull that off and to get. To get a city to invest, I mean, it was something like $800 million in that to just, and the freeway off ramp and the access and so forth. Give it up to Eisner. He made it so that you could have an expansion to Disney California Adventure be successful, a third gate be successful. He laid the groundwork and the foundations for those things to be pulled off. Yeah. Because if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have that surrounding support, it's much harder to invest in Anaheim. Without those things than it is, than it is with them. The other thing too, he got the Disneyland Hotel, the Disneyland name for hotels back from the Rather Corporation. Wow! Remember, Disney does that deal. He's sitting there in 1955, and he's like, "Oh my God, I need a hotel. Like I just don't have the money. I don't have anything." We're at a point here, fellas. Back in 55, this is about. Maybe I want to say May or something like that of 55. He's cashing out his life insurance to pay for the Mark Twain. Wow. I mean, that's kind of where he's at with the Disneyland project. He just is tapped out. And again, people think, well, he had so many assets from Disney, couldn't he? No, they were separate entities at that point.
Right.
It'd be a huge conflict of interest if he's drawn money away from one of his other companies into the Disneyland project, because it's using company assets in a way that you're not supposed to, that kind of thing. And that was a kind of a thing going down the line, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, he's just strapped for cash, and he needs an investor to get a Disneyland hotel on site. Jack Rather, he's this guy who's doing business in oil. He's making a lot of investments in Hollywood and so forth. He's got money. And Disney begs him, "Please, Jack, we need some money here to get a hotel. And Jack is like, I don't think this is gonna work here, guy. I'm not. And Disney's like, okay, what if I give you the exclusive rights to the Disney name in all of Southern California for 99 years?
Wow.
And Rather's like, all right, well, you talked me into it. I'll build a modest little hotel. At that point, it was a motel, really. And we'll go from there. Huge success, stunning success, just hand over fist. And Walt, to his credit, was very much like, listen, I'm grateful that you did this. Let's work together in facilitating this. New Orleans Square, for example, it's built the way it is to hide out the towers that Jack Rather wanted to build for the Disney Hotel.
Wow.
It was a very cooperative thing.
Interesting.
Rather understood, hey, Golden Goose, I don't want to intrude. And Disney was like, hey, let's make this work. And let's facilitate your dream in turning the Disneyland motel into a Disneyland hotel, for realsies.
Interesting.
The monorail, the first stop it makes after its construction is the Disneyland hotel. He felt like, hey, look, you did this thing for me. Let's integrate this closer for guests staying there. And the only hotel that this thing's going to stop at is yours.
Oh, wow.
Great stuff. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Now, little caveat there. He says, listen, you just have to pay the fee to upkeep the monorail, right? The monorail station and all that. He's like, okay, no problem. Now walk it, it's, decades down the line here, look at the Eisner era come in and says, hey, we want to do what we did in Walt Disney World to what we said, right? Build the resorts, make it multi-day, all that. And they come back to him and say, we can't. And it's like, why? We can't build a hotel in, the Disneyland Resort area, or what was to be known as the Disneyland Resort area, because Jack Rather has the exclusive name. He has exclusive rights. And it's like, what? We don't have control of the name in Anaheim? What are you talking about? So it was all about wrangling that name away from them, and they just wouldn't budge. The Rather Corporation, nah. I like the arrangement how it is. You're gonna have to come to me with a bigger offer, and I'm not budging. And Eisner, oh God, he takes that monorail fee because look, he's got this guy who's like, he's the hatchet man. He's the guy that gets it done, right?
Right.
And it's like, listen, we need to get this hotel name back. Find out what you can do. Goes through all the legal proceedings and finds out, they have an obligation to maintain the monorail station. It's that deal that Disney did. And it's like, oh, okay. That's what we use. And we'll set the fee to whatever we want. And forcing the Rather Corporation not just to sell the name back, but they took on the entire company, which is why they inherited the Spruce Goose and the Queen Mary in Long Beach to create that situation where they could have two entities like the Long Beach and Anaheim battle it out. That's where the Disney Seas projects and so forth, that's where that all emanates from. And look, Michael Eisner, to his credit, he got the name back and gave Disney the ability to build out more hotels and make the resort what it is. You might not like the way he did it, but he got it done.
And maybe that's ultimately the legacy of Michael Eisner. Maybe Michael Eisner was the seed planter. Maybe he was the guy who sort of maybe didn't see these concepts to their fullest, but he planted the seeds. Like, DCA wasn't the best park it could have been, but he planted the seed. He got it going. Right. So other CEOs like Bob Iger can come in and flesh it out. He planted the seeds for things like Pixar, the Pixar acquisition. Yeah. Maybe that's Eisner's legacy, is he was the seed planter, and he did a good job. I mean, he definitely, you couldn't have had a successful Bob Iger era without a lot of those seeds that Michael Eisner planted.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I agree. Look, Michael Eisner did have his flaws. For the biggest one, I would say one of the biggest ones was Marvel. They had multiple times they were able to buy Marvel and acquire it. And Eisner just couldn't see it. He just couldn't see how it integrated, the brand integration. He just couldn't see it. And that got Marvel into trouble with some of their licensing agreements and so forth down the line. Would we have had the Avengers in the MCU that we know today had he done that back then? Probably not, but it's just crazy to think about now. The most successful property in history. And you passed on it? But that was Eisner,
It was crazy to think too, because we've actually talked about this same thing on this show about, our superheroes, like are they appropriate for the Disney brand? And I stand true to this. I mean, it's like pirates, princesses, and superheroes. They're all the same. Like, it's that same kind of mentality, that same idea of like children looking up to these heroes, whether it's Davy Crockett, right? Whether it's Iron Man, whether it's where, it's the same kind of idea. And superheroes fit so well. Look, superheroes are a semi-modern thing, not really super modern. They've been around for a while, but it's in the same vein of a Davy Crockett, or Lone Ranger, I mean, it's the same idea. And for Eisner to not to see that, to not to have that, foresight, blows my mind. I really don't get it. I really don't get it.
But Eisner, the thing about him was he was very attached to the brand. He was very much attached to like what it meant, like what Disney meant to other people, and look, that tripped him up so many times. It's like Marvel being the big one, right? But just little stuff like, we're not going to serve alcohol in Disneyland Paris. Why? Because that's just not Disney. And it's like, yeah, but the culture expects alcohol to be sold.
Right.
It's just they don't have they don't have the same thought regarding alcohol that we do here in the States, especially at that time. And it's like, no, we're not going to serve alcohol. And that turns a lot of people off because of that. And it's like, Jesus, man, if you're just a little less,
like less rigid,
yes, of what you thought the brand was, you could be far more successful. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that was, again, one of the strengths of Bob Iger, in that he had a much more balanced approach to that legacy. Yep. He definitely understood more of like a foot in the past, respecting the past, respecting the nostalgia, but understanding that Disney is a forward-thinking company and we have to also go forward. It's not all about just the past. And Eisner was definitely more nostalgia-driven, legacy-driven, the old ways driven. And Iger kind of straddled it in a much more healthier, forward-thinking approach.
I think so. And, the thing about it is, the weird thing is Eisner didn't start out that way, I mean, he was very much like, hey, look, you're having a dead guy run your company because everybody kept doing, hey, what would Walt have done? It's like, well, wait a minute, we got to put this in the 21st century here, fellas. I mean, this is crazy. So like he does a deal with George Lucas to get a Captain EO or a Star Tours or an Indiana Jones in the park. That had never been done before. That was like completely shocker, thinking that was just out of the box. Some of that was already in motion with Tony Baxter and so forth, but that's kind of different. I think he was like very much like, okay, we got to modern this up. But then he built this kind of sandcastle that he was very much, he didn't want to lose, didn't want to, he was very protective of what he had done and the legacy that he was entrusted with.
So he was scared to risk it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of those things, like the Disneyland Paris thing and Frank Wells, I think a lot of that came out of that. And that's why his mentality and things changed going forward after that. And it really was detrimental to the company. And it was what he didn't want. I don't think Michael Eisner envisioned what would happen later with the Save Disney campaign and all of that. I don't think that's what he intended, but that's what happened, during these major events, and it's sad. But look, Iger, he's a guy who he like has the vision. Like when George comes up to him and says, "Hey, I'm looking to sell Star Wars," and this is like you know, Bob Iger is down for the opening of Star Tours, The Adventures Continue in Walt Disney World. And remember, they do that media thing. When, you know, it's pretty funny. If you ever look up the opening day media presentation for Star Tours out in Florida, it's really fun because they put, you know, they make like these two people in Jedi robes, and they're battling with lightsabers and stuff going through the park and stuff like that, and then they go up to the stage and you turn out, oh, it's Michael Eisner and Bob Iger and George Lucas, and it was really fun, really creative. But before that happens, George Lucas kind of says, hey, I'm looking maybe to get out of Star Wars, you know.
Wow.
And Iger's like, whoa.
Well, let me get my
checkbook,
about buddy.
Exactly, right? He's like, do you think you'd be willing to sell? You know, if we kind of could put that into motion. And that's the difference. Is Iger you know, it's the cow, right? It's like, right. I understand there's a hit property, this is what works, this is what hits. We're gonna integrate this into the company in a similar way we've done with Marvel, which gave it up to him. I mean, and honestly, with the Marvel deal, that played into it a little bit, just like it did with the Pixar deal. John Lasseter was a guy who came up to Kevin Feige and said, "Hey, look, you should be open to this idea of Disney acquiring you, because they'll be consistent with your brand, and they won't like meddle with it, so to speak. Right. They'll let you be you." And, you know, Feige kind of influenced that with George. It's like, hey, they'll let this, they will not meddle with it in the same way, in the way that maybe you think other companies might. And give it up. You know, that's Iger.
Wow.
You know, understanding what he has and understanding what works, understanding what doesn't. Star Wars is a little bit different in that respect, as far as my view, but that's a whole other story.
It's incredible. These two men have played such an enormous role in Disney history. I'm curious about the future with a Bob Chapek era. We'll see. We'll probably do a future down the road of a Bob Chapek era. But fascinating conversation. And we can go on for hours with this because there's so much to go on. Between Eisner and Bob, there is so many years with those two men running this company. Mm-hmm. It's incredible. But they both are, in every sense of the word, legends. They are Disney legends, absolutely. Both of these men have contributed greatly, you know, to the Walt Disney Company. You know, each one has their faults, but they are definitely Disney legends.
Bar none. Their contributions to Disney cannot be understated. I mean, Eisner turned what was a fledgling studio that was last in every single box office performance and every single metric into a global empire. You know, and Iger was like, okay, take that, turn up to 11. And that's what that is, you know?
Wow. Fascinating. Unbelievable. Well, incredible. Absolutely incredible. Let's pivot. We have the last and final topic in the Orange Nerd Show today. We're going to talk about, this is just kind of speculation. And, you know, this topic has come up a lot, and that's why I wanted to talk about it today. Should Apple buy the Walt Disney Company? I've seen this argument made so many times. This rumor comes up in, like, you know, Hollywood, you know, the Hollywood trades and gossip sites all the time. But what are your thoughts, Vash, on the prospect of an Apple buying the Walt Disney Company? Do you think it's a good idea, bad idea, good for one company, bad for the other, vice versa? What are your feelings on this?
Well, there's a reason all this stuff comes up. And I'll just say this. It would be far more beneficial to Apple than it would be for Disney.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I mean, look, the reason this keeps coming up is, honestly, I think Bob Iger's book actually talks about it, right? How he became good friends with Steve Jobs after or during, you know, everything surrounding the Pixar acquisition, right? I mean, he actually became really good friends with him, and Bob Iger was placed on the board of Apple.
Yeah, up until recently. I think that was up until when they bought Fox, I believe, right? Is when
Disney Plus. It was
Or
Disney.
Disney Plus.
I'm sorry, Apple Plus. It was Apple Plus. The
Okay.
launch of Apple Plus that kind of like, whoa, I can't be on here. This is a huge conflict of interest at this point. But he had an appreciation for Apple and the Apple mentality and Steve Jobs himself and so forth. And he was a big player. And this is why, when you look at Disney parks and a lot of the integration with technology, it usually hits Apple first, because those ties they're close, And from Apple's point of view, it's very simple. It is, we make hardware. We make software, but we make hardware. We make essentially entertainment delivery devices.
Right.
In certain respects, especially with the iPod and so forth. And we, had iTunes, obviously, but it's like, what better feather in the cap of a hardware product than entertainment or media to go along with it? And that's what they view Disney as. It's not so much the other, the way that Disney's diversified throughout all these different layers. It's, hey, they produce content. They produce media. And that would be a huge package to deliver to a customer. It's like, hey, here's an iPhone and you have direct access to, a company like Disney's entire library. And that's why that conversation has been had before. And Apple has circled the wagons many times. I mean, I think it was Bob Iger in his book, wasn't that correct? Where he said if Steve Jobs was still alive, we might have merged.
Yeah, he did. In Ride of a Lifetime, he mentioned that. Yeah. And you know what? The potential is there. Mm-hmm. I do agree with you, though. I do think it would have benefited Apple a whole lot more than Disney. Mm. There are some benefits to for Disney to be part of the Apple umbrella. One of those I think that might be interesting would be its impact on Imagineering. Yes. Apple's research and development division might be able to work closely with Imagineering. That might have been an interesting thing to kind of explore in terms of technology for the parks and stuff like that. But you're right, though. I mean, I think that Apple would have gained a huge amount with the content. Disney, I mean, in terms of content, I mean, it already has a platform with Disney Plus. Yeah. It doesn't really need Apple. I guess the only thing Apple could really give them in terms of content would be maybe, if you buy an iPhone, you get a year free of Disney Plus, kind of get people's feet wet with Disney Plus maybe. But overall, it would definitely help Apple a whole lot more.
Oh my God. It would be sensational. I mean, you'd have access to the biggest studio powerhouse in Hollywood today. I mean, oh yeah. I mean, it's just, that's it. It doesn't get quite bigger than the, Marvel, Lucasfilm, Disney, feature animation.
I mean, Mickey Mouse.
Pixar,
I mean, next to like, I mean, I can't think of a character or a symbol that's more recognizable than Mickey Mouse. I mean, it's incredible, Yeah,
and it's just all of that, and you could definitely see how Apple could integrate a company like Disney into their, it's in their wheelhouse, so to speak. But you talk about technology. Iger has been, and JPEG too, surprisingly enough, have been very technology focused when it comes to the parks. Yeah. And could you imagine Apple integration in the parks? I mean, it'd be insane. You could do things that, historically maybe thought unthinkable.
Right.
And how that, you could maybe put proprietary technologies in Apple products and so forth to make that integration that much more seamless. I mean, there's, you could go crazy with some of these ideas.
I mean, imagine if, let's just say, imagine if Apple did buy Disney and Apple's research and development department or whatever was in charge of creating new people mover vehicles, and stuff like that, or new technology to move the ride vehicles. I mean, how incredible would that be? I mean, that would just be insane, absolutely insane.
You could, I mean, there's so many different avenues you could go with this. And look, we have seen what happens when Disney acquires a brand like Marvel, right? When Marvel was acquired back in 2009, Thor 2 and Captain America Winter Soldier were in production at that time. And honestly, when Disney came in, it was like, hey, we love what you're doing. Here's a big sack of cash. Come back with something bigger, you know? And they infused that economic contribution into those projects and made them what they were. Captain America Winter Soldier is one of the best Marvel movies of all time, in my opinion.
No, I completely agree with you. I love that movie.
I just love that movie. It's just so great, so big, but hey, give it up to Disney. They invested, they saw the vision, and I love that. Could you imagine if Apple, bought Disney and merged and fused it with its own? With the trillions of dollars that Apple has at its disposal, and just go to Imagineering and say, here's a big wad of cash, come back with some. I mean, could you imagine? Like, it'd be ridiculous. I mean, it would be unbelievable. But the question really is, it's like, well, wait a minute, does Disney retain that autonomy to do what it does? How much oversight would they have under a banner like Apple? What would they expect from them? Would the parks even be a thing? Do they have does Tim Cook have the vision? That kind of thing. That's where it starts to get a little bit like, ooh, maybe this isn't the best idea.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, the comparisons of a Tim Cook and a Bob Chapek. And, and a lot of people might disagree with me on this, but I don't think there's a lot of daylight between these two men in terms of their leadership styles. There's a lot of similarities. Bob Chapek replaced a visionary in Bob Iger. Bob Iger is very much a visionary. He's a businessman, but he's a visionary.
Yeah.
And Bob Chapek is much more of a look. He's not going to destroy the company. The company will not go bankrupt and will not go under. It's going to be he's going to tread water. He's not going to do anything, in my opinion, that's going to just completely blow your freaking mind. He'll do enough to keep the legacy going and to keep the company afloat, is what Chapek will be. And largely that's what Tim Cook has been for Apple. Steve Jobs was a visionary, an incredible man. I mean, like akin to a Walt Disney almost, where he changed the world in so many ways. And Tim Cook has really just sort of, kind of rested on those laurels and sort of, hey, look, you know what? We're not going to create anything earth changing, but we know what, your iMac will come in 3 different colors now.
It's black.
It's black.
Ooh.
And it's bigger. Oh,
exactly, right?
That's exactly what it is. Tim Cook and Bob Chapek are not that different, So how much ambition will a Disney under an Apple with Tim Cook leading it have? I just don't know. Steve Jobs, whole other story, but Tim Cook.
And I think that's why Iger was open to that idea, because I think Steve kind of knew.
Right.
I think many comparisons have been made to Steve Jobs and Walt Disney. Now, I think some of those comparisons, they're rough fits. But honestly, when you take a vision, when you take ambition, there's almost no better comparison.
Right.
Walt was ambitious, especially later on in his life. It's just like this guy went from, okay, we're going to make like the first
sound cartoon. Yeah,
sound cartoon or first animated film. Like, okay, that's pretty mind-blowing, especially back in that day.
Right.
And then what is it, 40, 30 years down the line, we're going to make a city of tomorrow. It's like, how do you get there? It's like, what? That's Walt, and Steve, give the man credit. He's like, I want a freaking computer in every single house in the world, and it's just like, whoa.
Yeah.
Okay, and that kind of ambition. I think that's what attracted Iger to the idea or the possibility of a merger or a fusion or a buyout or whatever.
Right.
That kind of ambition. And when Steve Jobs was not around, it's just, that doesn't really, it's just doesn't really work.
Yeah.
And I think that's why that's why he says in his book, if that would have happened, that versus I'm not entertaining this idea past this point,
Yeah.
So,
The two men, Bob Iger and Steve Jobs, from what I understand, were very close. Steve Jobs was really vital to the Bob Iger era. I think he inspired Iger. I think he counseled Iger. The Iger era, I think, would have been very different without Steve Jobs there.
Yeah. I mean, it was really a gift that Steve Jobs did stay with us as long as he did.
Yeah.
Man, he just would have wished that maybe that situation was different, but it to have Steve facilitate the Pixar deal, that was huge. I mean, even in that way, that profoundly changed the course of the company.
Oh yeah.
And the Iger era just wouldn't be the same without that infusion of creative talent. That really shaped the company at that time. So I'll give it up. But the idea of Disney being owned by some other corporation or company is not new.
Right.
It is old. When Walt died, there were a bunch of different corporations and companies who were circling the waters and going, Walt's not around, huh? Those theme parks look pretty cool. Can we, maybe buy that subsidiary, and buy different aspects of the company, merge it with others. And Roy, to his credit, said, no, not even going to entertain this thought. We're going forward without my brother, and we're going to do Walt Disney World. And engineers and everybody attached to different projects, sigh of relief, that wasn't going to happen. But that was the real risk at that point in 1967 and so forth. But then, during the Michael Eisner era, Comcast comes in knocking and says, and this company looks pretty good. Let's see if we how would you like to get bought out here? And Comcast, what they wanted was ESPN. That was the whole big thing about it. That's what they wanted. They wanted the mothership. And it's kind of crazy to think about now to see where all these things have kind of fallen. Comcast is now they're rebranding NBC Sports and so forth. Interesting. But back in the day, it was all about ESPN. It was that much of a powerhouse that Comcast was like, yeah, we want this. And Michael Eisner had to stave that off. And did it, successfully. But man, that was a tumultuous time too, because that was when the Save Disney stuff was going on, and he was getting pressure from the board to resign and all kinds of stuff. But he was able to stave off that potential buyout from Comcast that would have changed the company in its own right, which created a lot of the tensions you feel today between Disney and Comcast, Universal, all that kind of stuff. It's got its histories there. But the best place to find more info on that is the Disney War book. Goes into the best, probably the best piece of literature or book that you can go into to find all that out. But it's very, this has been entertained before, and I think it will be again. We'll see.
Yeah, and that was interesting because even Roy Disney on the Save Disney website was entertaining the idea. The nephew, Roy Disney, was entertaining the idea of like Comcast coming in and buying it. He was open to it. I remember that, and like that was very, very interesting. Now, it wouldn't have been a disaster because I think that I think Comcast has done a good job. Some would even argue a great job at managing Universal and their parks. They've really built that brand quite well, actually. The best in any modern owner, because Universal's been bought and sold a few times over the years. Comcast has definitely been the best at sort of sharpening that brand vision, and they've done a really good job. So would they have done a terrible thing for Disney? I don't think so. I think they would have done a good job with Disney. I think they would have respected it like they have Universal. Like it would have been fine. But I prefer, obviously, for Disney to remain its own autonomous thing. But I think that if Comcast did ultimately succeed, it wouldn't have been a disaster. Not at all.
I like the competition. I like that. People have said it's like, well, Wizarding World, Harry Potter. What if that was because Disney? They had their chance. They were this close, and they screwed that up.
They
and
did.
J.K. Rowling goes to Universal, instead, because of Dr. Seuss's Widow. And so, that's how that whole thing goes. But people have said, oh well, would it have been better? Would it have been worse? Listen, J.K. Rowling wanted a vision. She wanted something, and Disney was like, hey, we're not going to play ball with that. We're Disney. And when Universal came up, it creates, they're hungry. And it creates severe competition where, part of Bob Iger's motivation to get the parks up and running, to get them, imbued with cash and quality, part of that is driven by the competition that Universal brings to the table. Wow. And I like that. But to bring it back to, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say too, like, I agree with you about the competition thing. Like, here's the thing: you don't want to be in a situation where you own everything. And Disney, if they had Potter on top of Pixar, on top of Marvel, on top of Star Wars, on top of Fox, on top of Disney's own epic library in and of itself, it's just too much. I'm glad Universal got the Potter rights, because at least other companies now have some other big feathers in their cap. Yeah. I wish Universal, and we've talked about this before in the past, would get a little more aggressive in buying other studios. I think they should make a play for Warner Media. It's not done yet with Discovery. That would be a good move. But I want to see these other companies. I don't want to see, as much as I love Disney, I don't want to see them own everything under the sun. Yeah. These other companies owning some other stuff too, I think is a good, like you said, good for the overall market, or, the competition. I think it's a good thing. Definitely.
Yeah. And, listen, Disney, that is one thing that they own so much that they're stretched very thin.
Right.
And that's why people ask, like, oh, what about the Muppets and all this kind of stuff they own? It's like, yeah, but they got guys doing Marvel, you got guys doing Star Wars, you got guys doing all this different stuff. Who do you have left to do a Muppets?
Right.
And that's kind of the bad thing about having so many of their properties be owned by themselves. Is it's just, you need people to manage them. You need people to kind of get the air underneath their wings, so to speak, and let them fly. You can't do that when you're spread so thin. So that's the other part of this. Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. You know what? Maybe one day there will be a Apple Disney big conglomerate. You never know.
Hey, Steve Jobs' widow, largest shareholder at Disney. Just saying.
Is she really?
Yeah.
Oh, she got all his shares.
Yes. So the part of the Pixar deal was Steve Jobs be the largest shareholder. Where does that estate go when he dies? Goes to his wife. Now the largest shareholder. And, that's another thing, too. You create very powerful shareholders through these acquisitions. And that has certain pluses and minuses when it comes to that. And maybe why we're stuck with Chapek as CEO may have something to do with that. I don't know. We'll see. But, it's one of those things. So you never know.
You never know. You never know. I think if that does happen, I think, and this is just me spitballing here, but I think if it does happen, I think it'll be under a much more ambitious Apple CEO than Tim Cook.
Probably.
Maybe someone down the road, him or her will be, the next Steve Jobs, or someone with a little more vision. Mm-hmm. I don't see Tim Cook being that guy. He seems very safe in a lot of ways, but we'll see. Yeah. Hey, you know what? The guy might surprise me. But so far, I just don't see it in them. But maybe someone down the road will run Apple and be like, hey, you know what? Hey, Disney, let's do this. Finally, right?
Maybe. And I wonder, look, this is going to sound nuts, guys.
No, go ahead.
But here, I'm just thinking about this. Why was Chapek selected? Why was he the guy? How long do we really think Chapek's going to be in that seat?
Right, exactly.
Are moves being made now? I don't know. We'll see.
It's very, very interesting. And Bob Iger, I'm telling you, man, this guy, he definitely, I don't want to digress too far, but he definitely, I think even when he leaves the company, he's going to have a lot of power at Disney.
Oh, yeah.
Influence over the board, things like that. Definitely something to watch. Game of Thrones, baby. Game of Thrones.
I know. Everything that Iger does is calculating, guys. I'm telling you, everything he does is calculating. Why do you still have his shares? Okay, that's a whole nother. It's a whole other thing. Whole other thing. But we'll see.
We'll see. But Dre, thank you so much for coming on, brother. I do appreciate it. And thank you all for watching another episode of the Orange Nerd Show. Mr. VashSky, if you can let everybody at home know where they can find you on social media.
Best place to interact with me is at VashSky on Twitter. That's right here, right there. And that's the best place to find me and interact with me in that regard. If you want to watch me, well, I'm on your channel, man. We're at Freshly Squeezed, your source for juicy news, information squeezed fresh, right from the Orange Grove. So that's where it is.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you all for watching. Comment below with your thoughts on modern references in the Disney animated films, the thought on Apple buying Disney, and Bob Iger, his era versus Michael Eisner. What are your thoughts on both of these eras? I would love to hear from you. Vash would love to hear from you. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye, guys.